Okay, we're ready to start. Yes. Put all your electronic devices away. Pretend we're in an airplane and you can't look at any screen until we get below. Was it 10,000 feet? Can't remember now. Whatever. So, we're on to more lactation. We had fun yesterday. We had a dog. We did a DNA swab. We did talk about some lactation. Of course, everything that happens in this class during the scheduled time is assessment eligible. Yesterday I told you how I did the emergency mastectomy. Luckily, the sheep wasn't lactating. Otherwise, she probably would have died before we got to her, right? She would have had big blood vessels supplying a working mammary gland. The tearing that the dogs did would have probably caused her to lose a lot of blood, although they did kill one sheep, sorry. So, anybody have any questions before we move on? Here we go.
I have a couple.
Good.
So the first was, yesterday we talked about some of the hormones that were involved with lactation. What does the placental lactogen?
Okay. So now, yeah, try not to do the little chattering because there's probably somebody behind you that wants to listen. So remember, if you want to chatter, there's a hallway, there's outside, right? Okay, what does placental lactogen do? Let's look at the name. Placental, that means it's coming from the placenta, and lactogen is a term that means promoting lactation. So what's kind of neat, in some species, the placenta makes hormones, and it hasn't been discovered in all species, so I'm kind of being general. For us, that's fine. If you take a repro class, there's different discoveries of placental lactogen. First of all, they're usually protein in nature, those hormones. You should know the placenta makes a whole bunch of things. And I think actually in the endocrinology section of our videos, there's a thing that says placental lactogens, if I remember right. So these are hormones given off by the placenta, and they target the mammary tissue and tell the mammary tissue to get ready for the offspring that's developing in the uterus. And what's kind of neat in animals that bear more than one offspring, the more placentas you have, the more placental lactogen you have in the blood, the bigger the mammary glands grow. So it's kind of a nice little signaling thing. If there's 3 ovine fetuses, ovine sheep, then that mammary gland would be bigger than if there were 2 ovine fetuses, or versus 1 ovine fetus. It's not going to be 2 times total or 3 times total. It's going to be bigger, but not in units of 1. Otherwise, if a sheep had 4 fetuses developing, she may not even be able to walk. You know what I mean? It's not like that great a difference, but it is bigger. So then, when lactation starts, which is usually the time that birth occurs, then the mammary gland has been actually told beforehand, make more milk than you normally would. Okay, placental lactogen. Is that pretty good? Okay, thank you. Next question.
So in the quiz, one of the questions was if you have this many pounds of H2, or how to figure the pounds of water in a pound given the pounds of milk. Was one of the questions, and I wasn't sure how to do that properly.
Okay. So if you have, say, 100 pounds of milk, how many pounds of water did it take to make it, let's say, for example? So then you got to know the percentage of water in milk. And I'm going to say it's like 88%. We can look it up in Google, but milk is about 88% water, right? And there's other things in it, but there's a lot of water in milk. So I'm going to say 88, maybe 90. I could look at the answer and we could back calculate. And then the other thing is, sorry, it varies a little bit by species, and it also varies by stage of lactation. Because when that first milk comes out, the colostrum, it's probably got a lower total water content because it's got more proteins in it and so forth. But I'm gonna guess about 88%. Could somebody, Sarah, maybe somebody, one of you guys look this up, percent water in milk. But remember, it would be varied by species. but here we just do general things to get the gist of it. Anybody tell me?
95.
95? 95 is a little high, so I'm not gonna like really.
Well, it says 85 to 95.
Okay, yeah. So 88 is not bad, you know. That's kind of the figure I remember, but again, it depends on what animal you're talking about. But 88, maybe 90 at the most. I wouldn't. 95 would be. That's too high, but it might be. There might be some animal out there that has 95% water content in milk. That's a little high for my taste. Okay. Excellent questions. That's why we're here, because a lot of times you can't find that stuff out there. Okay, well, good. Sorry, I got a little sore throat today. I want to go to some of the reading, because I think if I look at past assessments, that's where the most points are lost. If you look at like assessment 6, 7, 8, it's like, man, that was in the reading. That's a statement out of the reading. Sometimes in the reading, on one computer screen, I just copy paste a sentence from the reading, put it into the assessment, and then take out a word and leave it, you know, make a blank there, and then put that choice down in one of the 6 choices. So I mean, sometimes it's like verbatim. I think one time last week there was that one question, I can't remember what it was, but it was verbatim out of the reading, and I can't remember what it was right now. But anyway, so let me go to some of the reading, and we will go through some of this. And of course, I'm always going to add stuff to it, right? So it's kind of like a guide for me, but not a complete guide. Okay, so a couple things. One is this website that's up here is the best ever for lactation. Okay? If you ever want to know anything about lactation, see where it says ANSI 438 up there? Well, click on it. You can click on it. That's over at Illinois, and it's written by somebody that's done a lot of lactation research. So, like, this is like the go-to place, and it's free, right? That's the other thing. You don't have to buy any books. So anyway, this goes through and talks about secretory tissue. So that's the tissue that makes the milk. But you should, I think it was Sarah or Aaron yesterday said, there's suspensory ligaments. There's a lot of construction that holds up that mammary tissue. And the dairy cow is the best example, right? That mammary gland, I've never dissected one off on a dairy cow and weighed it, but man, if it's full of milk, I can't imagine how heavy that thing is. So a lot of times there's a lot of weight, and if it's not suspended correctly, it's going to kind of get dislocated, and over time, it's probably not going to be as functional as it should. So you've got to have a lot of good support. Anyway, we're talking about secretory tissue, and maybe the one thing I should say is that sometimes organs or tissues have what's called functional units. You should always kind of make like maybe even a page that says functional unit and then all the things we've talked about. And for example, the kidney, what's the functional unit of the kidney? The nephron. What's the functional unit of the lungs? The alveolus. What's the functional unit of the mammary glands? Alveolus. So alveolus is a term that means a small sac-like structure that holds X. In the lungs, it doesn't hold milk, it holds air. But in the mammary tissue, it holds milk when it's working. And that's the other thing about mammary tissues. Yesterday, I remember I said it's a modified skin gland, and it's not always making milk, whereas the lungs are always working, right? Those alveoli are always working. And so here's a term, parenchyma, parenchymal. That means the functional unit of that tissue, and then the antonym of parenchyma is stroma. That was on, I think, an assessment, because you need tissue that's supporting as well. Mammary tissues always have a lot of fat in them, fat pad, especially when they're not lactating. So, and the parenchyma is the tissue that is making the milk. And then these small little air-like, small sac-like structures that we call the alveoli, they bunch together like grapes. And then it's actually, a grape is a good analogy. If you go and look at the grocery store, the grapes have they collect on a stem, and then the stems get bigger and they get bigger, and that's how mammary tissue is made. And then all those stems, think of them as pipes, they dump into the teat area, right? And so there's all kinds of organization here. We're not going to get into it, but they are in lobes and lobules, and that's basically just saying they are grouped together. And then I think it was Sarah yesterday or Aaron, I can't remember which one, they talked about the myoepithelial cells. And I'm not sure if they're found any place else in the body. That would be a good little question. But the thing is, myo is muscle, and epithelium is usually tissue that lines free surfaces. Like this is epithelium. The whole lining of the GI tract is epithelium. But these are specialized that they can contract. And that's, I don't think of any place else in the body where there's myoepithelial cells. There's obviously myocytes all over, and there's epithelial cells all over, but I don't know if there's any myoepithelial cells anyplace else. But they have this ability to contract, and they surround each alveolus. So think of this alveolus, this little grape-like structure, and it's full of milk, and there's one tube leading out of it. And when the myoepithelial cells contract, it expresses the milk into the ducted system. That process is called milk letdown. It's not called milk production. It's called milk letdown. And it's promoted by the hormone oxytocin, which I know was mentioned yesterday. So oxytocin's claim to fame for lactation, at least, is it causes milk letdown. And it has a very short half-life, like just a couple minutes. It works very rapidly and it's gone. And what's kind of neat about it is, we know it comes from the posterior pituitary, and higher inputs, quote unquote, can influence how much oxytocin is released. What do I mean by higher inputs? Sights, sounds, smells can influence how much oxytocin is released. If you're a gentle person and you love your cows, when they start walking up to the milking parlor, they might let their milk down out in the holding lot because they're excited to see you, because they know they're going to get milked, and some of that pressure they want to be relieved. And they might get some feed in the milking parlor. A lot of times they don't, but sometimes they do. Or they might get fed afterwards. A beef cow out in Nebraska, here comes her calf over the ridge. She might let her milk down at the sight of her calf. Release oxytocin. Because things in the brain can feed into the hypothalamus and cause milk letdown. The typical, and we talked about this yesterday, was the neuroendocrine reflex, where the sensory nerves in the mammary gland are stimulated by the calf or the milking person, the person that's going to milk. And that sends an afferent neural signal to the brain, goes to the hypothalamus, and then the hypothalamus says, I'm going to release oxytocin. And that's wired in utero, right? That's called a neuroendocrine reflex. But the sight of your calf can release oxytocin. The sound, if the milker plays country western music, they've done this. I think country western was the best for milk, getting milk out of the cow. I think hard rock, heavy metal was the worst. Okay, so that's that stuff. Connective tissue, stromal tissue. Now, always got to be aware, if you're a critical reader, almost every time there's mistakes. I haven't seen any mistake here, but when you're reading something, if it doesn't make sense, ask us or try to, I think they're fine, but be aware of that. Sometimes there's mistakes in books and writing. Okay, so that's that website. And the other thing is, when you click on a link, you don't follow any other links unless you want to, right? Sorry, so that page loaded, but then you don't click on any other links on that page. Because I'm not sure if the next link is the one after for the next one. Okay, so yeah, this is a whole different website. Okay, so here we go. They're talking about structure. and how many teats are in a mammary gland, and it gets confusing fast. Because, again, dairy cows are the best. They have 4 mammary glands, right? 2 pairs. And they operate independently. They have their own blood supply. They're walled off. So if one has bacteria in it, the other 3 may be fine, or they might all have bacteria in it. They're independent. And so you have, like, for example, there's those grape-like structures, but in one sense this is false because they wouldn't be this big relative to the teeth, and there's like thousands and thousands and thousands. So this is kind of like artificial, but it shows you the idea that they drain into a common area. So they have 1 canal per teat. And so like this teat has like basically 1 connection to the whole mammary gland. So that's cow, ewe, and goat, okay? Now the cow has 4 mammary glands, and you know, I say this loosely, and then the ewe and goat have 2, right? Okay? Now it gets complicated because now look at this sow. See how there's 2 ducts, 2 or 3 per teat? And sometimes people will say, there's 2 mammary glands per that 1 teat. Why do they say 2 mammary glands? Because this one would count as 1 and this one would count as 1. We don't get to that level of detail for us. So, and see like up here, the camel, 2 canals per teat. So you might say that teat is hooked up to 2 mammary glands. It gets confusing fast. Anyway, so the ewe and goat and the mare, they have actually 2, right? 2 mammary glands in essence. So I said ewe and goat, but I forgot the mare. Sows have many. And what do people look for? They usually count them. Are they in the sow or gilt? Are they looking for about 14? Is that kind of like? Is there some minimum in hog production? You people that do that? I think they're always trying to get 14 or so, and then of course they're spread along the whole underside of the animal. So that talks a little bit about placement. But if you remember, the cow has 4 mammary glands and 4 teats, and then the ewe, goat, and mare have 2 mammary glands, and they're in the inguinal area. That's in the lower abdomen area. And the cow also has inguinal. If you remember that, that's pretty good. But again, if you take a repro class, they get more into it. Okay, so here's a cutaway view of a cow, let's say, and it shows you this. I wonder if there's a chart here that where they're going to call number 6. They're calling that the teat sinus. Okay, see that word there? Teat sinus. You might say sinus. Isn't that in the nasal cavity? No, sinus is a general term that means a cavity filled with something.
So what's the difference between a sinus and a cistern?
Right. And let's see if 5 is a cistern. Is 5 the cistern? Gland sinus. Okay, gland sinus, teat cistern, teat sinus. There's actually not much difference. Okay, and sometimes people would label this a cistern too. So again, it's terminology that we won't get into. But the kicker is when milk is let down in the dairy cow, it collects in all of the duct system and it's out of the alveoli. Okay, they contract. The alveoli contract. But sinus is a general term. Then here's a term, supernumerary. We've had that before. Supernumerary always means above the normal number, because super always means kind of above. And so you can have a cow with 5 teats. The kicker is usually, and well, it varies, but sometimes there is some mammary tissue associated with that supernumerary teat. But a lot of times they actually cut those off, because they're just kind of in the way. Milking machines have 4 cups. There's not much milk out of that other teat. The other teat usually is off to the side someplace, but if you ever see supernumerary teats, that means more than the normal number. And usually they're rudimentary, but sometimes you squeeze those supernumerary teats and you can get some milk out of them because they are hooked up with some mammary tissue, usually of a small amount. Okay, and then support, like we talked about, you gotta support that big mammary gland. I'm just doing the highlights. Here's one alveolus. And you know, every alveolus has to have a blood supply, because yesterday we said 500 volumes of blood come into an alveolus. And you can say it this way, 500 drops of blood had to go through the blood supply to make 1 drop of milk. So obviously there's a lot of blood flow. And they make the milk, there's the lumen, there's epithelial cells. Notice how those don't say myoepithelial cells. These say epithelial cells, and over here, these are myoepithelial. Because the epithelial cells are what control what's in the lumen, what milk has in it. These things contract, and you kind of see when they contract, they would express the milk into the duct system. If you have an arteriole, you have a venule, right? You've got to take the blood supply out. So I'm going to say there's millions of those. There's a blood supply, and I think somebody showed this yesterday. Yesterday I was talking about how the mammary gland is a modified skin gland. It has no structures per se that go into the abdominal cavity, but there is a blood supply that comes in and goes out, obviously. But you know, the mammary gland, like I indicated yesterday, can come right off. And then of course, lymph. With all that blood flow, there's a lot of lymph made in the mammary gland. And of course, you know, that's going to go, it doesn't circulate, it's made from excess interstitial tissue, and it goes through lymph vessels back to the heart. It probably goes through a number of lymph nodes, right? And there you go. That's that reading. It's pretty straightforward. Notice here, it's a little bit, and I'm not sure how many, and so I'll talk about this right now. During first pregnancy, when the undergoes a marked increase in size, okay. So what happens is, when the animal is a fetus, the rudimentary mammary tissue and the teats are placed on the fetus, right? Because if you ever see, like when a female dog is born, there's teats, they're spread around. I mean, the males also have teats, and we'll talk about that. Why males don't respond to like some of the hormones, except in primates. Okay, so anyway, the framework is set down when the animal is a fetus. Then when the animal is born, and this happens in humans once in a while, there's some secretions that come out of the teats, the nipples, in women and men. Does anybody know what you call that secretion? If you see that in a newborn baby, there might be some liquid that's coming out of the nipples. Anybody know? Anybody heard that? Talk about that? It's called witch's milk. And I suppose years ago, there was some like kind of myths about it. So, you know, what in the world would a newborn baby have to do with making milk, right? So the old term, the long ago term was witch's milk. What it is, it's in response to all the hormones the baby saw during pregnancy. I'm going to go flip my camera, reset it. So sometimes you'll see some secretions in a newborn, and it's in response to all the hormones it saw in utero, because that placenta is making all kinds of things. And here's two of the things it makes that stimulates mammary tissue: estrogens and progesterones. So the placenta is a hormone-making factory. We talked about placental lactogen, but it also makes a lot of estrogen and progesterone, and you should write down those two hormones are famous for stimulating mammary tissue. Two of the most important hormones that stimulate mammary tissue: estrogens and progesterone. And that's what that reading prompted me to say. So, sometimes you get witch's milk. It's no big deal. I could call Renee, the gynecologist, and ask her what % of babies she delivers have witch's milk. Probably very, very low. But here's the kicker now. The rudimentary mammary tissue is there in the newborn, and it basically just grows in in relationship to the body size. So, it's not going to be very prominent as the baby grows or as the newborn, let's say, pig grows or whatever. But here's the kicker. It takes off at puberty. Puberty is where the gonads start working, and in the female, that's the ovaries. And here's the two famous hormones after puberty, and I'll show you in my hand what they do. Here's estrogen coming up in the blood. Then the animal ovulates. Estrogen goes down, but progesterone goes up. Progesterone goes down, estrogen goes up. Estrogen goes down, progesterone goes up. I just showed you the way to stimulate mammary tissue. Estrogen, then no estrogen. Progesterone, then no progesterone. That's very stimulatory to mammary glands. So after puberty, then the mammary glands grow faster relative to the body, right? They're going to get ready. So after puberty, all this cyclic exposure to estrogen and progesterone is very stimulatory. It's not the only hormones that affect the growth of the mammary tissue, but it's two very important ones. So then you could do an experiment. You could have 100 cows and overectomize 50 heifers, and then leave the other 50 to go through estrous cycles, and you would see the huge difference in mammary tissue. And you could prove that the cyclic estrogen and progesterone. Okay, so then when the animal gets pregnant, then there's even more mammary tissue growth because of all the hormones. Now during pregnancy, estrogen and progesterone do not do this. They don't do that. They basically, progesterone comes up and stays pretty high. Estrogen might be up a little bit. It gets high at the end, but it's mostly progesterone, but then you might have placental lactogens. So during pregnancy, the mammary gland is getting ready to make milk, right? It doesn't make milk during puberty, but it grows with that estrogen progesterone. So then at the end of pregnancy, like the switch is turned on, and then the mammary tissue makes milk. And then for dairy cows, it's quite a switch. It's not much different than the switch on that wall. You turn that mammary gland on, and it takes a lot of things out of the blood. And one of the critical things it takes out of the blood is calcium. And dairy cows, if they're not managed right, they can become paralyzed, go down, because they don't have enough calcium in their blood. And what's kind of amazing, some of the things you do before they calve helps you to prevent that great fall in calcium in the blood. Because the dairy cow cannot eat enough to meet all her requirements for calcium in her diet. She can't get enough calcium from her diet to keep her blood supplies up. But if I say the blood supplies in a good dairy cow are adequate, but they don't all come from the diet, where's calcium coming from? Bone. Bone is a depot tissue. And so she has to pull off calcium from her bone to support 100 pounds of milk a day. If she doesn't, she falls down and sometimes you can't get up because calcium is needed for muscle contraction and nerve function. And they're called downer cows, and I've seen this firsthand. I went to a farm one time with my buddy who's left us now, Jim, the best epithelial I've ever seen. The cow had it was out in a pasture, and the cow had dragged itself to this little stream to get some water. You could see the drag marks. She couldn't stand up, but she was so thirsty. And then you give her IV calcium, and in 5 minutes she's walking around. But she might go down again, because that's a temporary. And it's kind of pathetic sometimes. That whole thing is called milk fever. When the mammary gland turns on, drains the blood of calcium, and then they can't stand up. Because calcium is needed for muscle contraction, it's needed for nerve function. But somebody misnamed that years ago. Milk fever sounds like if you took the body temperature, there'd be a fever? There is no fever. No elevated body temperature. Might even be a little depressed. Anyway, a lot of stuff can go wrong with a dairy cow. Okay, so that's that. Good chapter to read. Obviously, I'm adding things all along here. Then they talk about lymph. This is more, it gives you an idea, lymph flow through the mammary gland. Okay, utter edema. Yeah, this is a good one. So you know edema is an excess collection of interstitial fluid. Okay, excess collection. Now here's a lateral view of a heifer. So it looks like a heifer mammary gland. And I'm going to outline the normal mammary gland. Right there. See where my line is? Normally, the front of the mammary gland would be right here. So now you got all this tissue, and it happens for some reason more in heifers than other animals, but that's utter edema right there. That's a great picture, very classic. And then when you have an animal with edema, sometimes you give them a drug to try to help them get rid of the excess body fluid. And what's that drug called in general? No, I just want the name of the general drug, not a drug name, but a class of drugs.
Diuretic.
Diuretics, thank you. Yeah, you give the animal a diuretic. Now the kicker is, when you have milking animals, you have to watch what you give them, because that's human food supply, right? There's withdrawal times on most things you give animals, so you just can't give them compound X because you think that works and then put it in the milk. So utter edema, very classic, more common in heifers. It's probably because their blood supply is not as big, right? Heifers have a smaller mammary gland than other animals. And so here's a term. A heifer is nulliparous. 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 I'll say it one more time. Nulli. Nulla. Parous. Parous. That means never giving birth before. Nulliparous. And so they've never lactated before. So then when they do calve, everything's a little smaller than normal. Okay? Then, after she gives birth, she's primiparous. Primi, parous. 1. And then, after she's given 2 or more births, she's called multiparous. And it's really spelled multiparous, but it's pronounced multiparous. Multiparous. So a nulliparous heifer would have a smaller venous drainage, smaller lymph vessels, probably a smaller arterial, but it's just the flow isn't happening. Now here's the other kicker about mammary glands. Remember how we talked about they're growing big and big, getting ready for lactation, and then they're lactating? Then, when lactation ends, the mammary gland does this. And that's called involution. So mammary glands undergo involution when they stop milking. And how do you make a mammary gland stop giving milk? What? You stop evacuating the mammary gland. That's how you stop lactation. So that's called drying up, right? A dry dairy cow is not, you're drying her up. She's not milking. Question? Anybody have a question? Okay. So yeah, how do you make a mammary gland give the most milk? Always take milk out of it. Milk it 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day. Of course, for dairy cattle, dairy farmers, dairy producers would not milk a dairy cow 8 times a day, but they definitely do 2. Some do 3. But if you did 4, they give more milk than if you milk them 3 times a day. The kicker is, the difference between 3 and 4 isn't much. It probably doesn't pay for everything. So I think, 2 is definitely standard, but 3 is, there might be places that do 3, I know they do. And then of course, nowadays, robotic milking. The dairy cow determines when she wants to. Now, tell me how many times, and they have records of this because it's all, how many times does a dairy cow go into a robotic milking, a milker a day? And usually they set a limit because some want to go in there all the time. Somebody help me in the audience. What's that? 5 or 6, yeah. And probably after 5 or 6, the computer says, no, I'm not letting you in anymore. You let the other girls in, okay? That's probably what they're doing. Because then you'll get more milk out of 5 or 6 milking episodes than you would 2, definitely. So it's kind of neat. If you ever, I know on my YouTube, I've got somebody made some videos of robotic milking, and it's pretty fascinating. Okay, see you tomorrow. That's a great place to end.